Bonjour à tous. It's good to see everyone. We are at the home stretch of Change Now 2023, and we have a real treat for everyone here for the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Welcome to Civic Action, from awareness to movement building. I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with recent popular movements such as the movement to abolish slavery, civil rights movements in North America, Arab Spring for pro-democratic forces, Black Lives Matter, etc. My name is Jonathan Jennings, and for most of my life, I have been speaking some version of truth to power. First, during the years I spent working with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and most recently during the years I've spent with the organization I lead called Health in Harmony. I couldn't be more excited and humbled to be moderating this panel. I'm so happy to be here with you as we get to know and learn from Clover, Luisa, Christian, and Jeremy. These are four incredible engines of change. They are catalyzing millions of others to make change for our planet. So I'm so excited to be here with you today. So let's get right into it. I want to introduce Clover Hogan, who is our first keynote. She's a 23-year-old climate activist, the executive director and founder of Force of Nature, which she founded when she was age 19. Now, when she was age 16, she was at the COP negotiations, COP21 in Paris, and she realized that the only thing more frightening than the climate crisis itself is feeling powerless in front of the crisis. So she made it her mission to mobilize mindsets. Force of Nature has inspired a global movement to step up and act rather than to shut down in the face of the climate crisis. So I would like for you all to give a very warm welcome to one of Change Now's very favorite people, Clover Hogan. Rock and roll.
Hello, you can hear me, cool. Hi everyone. So when I turned 11, I declared to my parents over dinner that I wanted to become an activist. Now, it was a bold statement built on a promise to myself that I wouldn't just be an activist, but I would be the most devout activist possible. 12 years later, and I'm a strict vegetarian, except for when I gorge on salmon sushi, kitchen lights off, should anyone discover my shameful secret. Like my boyfriend, who I only half-jokingly remind meat is murder every time he tries to order a hamburger. I don't shop fast fashion, except for socks. No matter how sustainable I want to be, I just can't justify €12 on a bit of eco-cloth to swaddle my feet. And come to think of it, I haven't really had to buy fashion for some time because of the amount I'm gifted by brands hoping I'll model them to my meager Instagram following. I refuse to drive a car, aka a gas-guzzling, planet-destroying combustion engine. Except when it's an absolute emergency, like when it's raining. Or when the idea of cozying up to a stranger on the bus is enough to make me want to throw myself in front of one. I've posted petitions against the destructive and toxic mining of copper and lithium from devices that would not function without them. Over the past decade, my idealistic activism has become a parade of caveats and contradictions. Now, when I started out as an activist, I thought I had to be perfect to be legitimate. And I vilified anyone who wasn't. I hurled moral ammunition at my dad for being a self-proclaimed animal lover while enthusiastically soaring into his steak. I could almost see the horns protruding from the shiny, bald scalps of the people running companies producing palm oil and plastic. I pleaded with my friends and family to watch the documentaries that made me sob in front of my computer screen, and I guilt-tripped them if they didn't upheave their lives to solve the cause of the week. It was only when I left school and started working that I encountered the first challenge to my puritanical activism. Being perfect wasn't just impossible, it was paralyzing, leaving me twisted in endless ethical knots and bound by the fear of taking a misstep. Now, if you Google how to solve the climate crisis, you will drown in a sea of articles featuring top tips on how you can do your bit. From buying reusable coffee cups to reducing food waste at home. Now, this is no mere coincidence. In 2004, BP, or British Petroleum, which promptly rebranded to Beyond Petroleum, came up with an ingenious marketing ploy. They created the carbon footprint calculator, an effective way to shine the spotlight on individuals and away from themselves. In the same period, they were profiting an average of £1 million per hour from fossil fuels. You may recall that just 6 years later, there was the BP oil spill, one of the worst environmental disasters in history. If you were holding out for a redemption arc, I am sorry to disappoint. Last year, BP profited $28 billion and actually reversed their plans to cut back on oil and gas production. Even though 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions, many climate conversations today circle around how long you shower, how you get around, which light bulbs you use. Remember that great quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist." Sounds kind of familiar, huh? Unfortunately, this trick has worked a great deal. It has served as an effective Trojan horse for companies to focus on quote-unquote consumer activism and given rise to countless types of greenwashing. There are the obvious ones like green labeling and suggestive imagery, simply using sustainable language and visuals with no evidence or certifications. A good example is H&M's Conscious collection. There is vagueness. Say the package around a plastic toy is labeled recyclable, without saying whether it refers to the package, the toy, or components of either. And then there's the rather bold-faced one of irrelevance. Say an aerosol spray advertised as CFC-free, when CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, the stuff that created the hole in the ozone layer, have been illegal in the US since 1978. Then there are the more insidious types of greenwashing. For example, hidden trade-offs. You might remember when Starbucks introduced straw-free lids in response to public outcry on plastic, but forgot to mention that the new lids actually use more throwaway plastic. Or there's selective disclosure. Say a car company praising its electric vehicles while ignoring the destructive and incredibly unjust mining practices to make its lithium batteries. There's also woke-washing, when companies use social movements to improve their optics. A brand is celebrated for changing its logo to the rainbow flag on Pride Day, or launching a campaign featuring black and brown faces on the anniversary of BLM. Yet its products may very well be manufactured in a country where it's illegal to be gay, or be made by children who had to drop out of school on slave wages to support their families. In the age of corporate activism, it is more important to be seen doing the right thing than actually doing it. And it's easy for companies to pass the buck onto individuals. Better yet, if they can make money off of us via sustainability premiums. Now, corporations may have built the Trojan horse, but media are the ones peddling it. I'm going to cue a video here. This is an interview between Richard Madley, a host at Good Morning Britain, and Miranda Wellahan, a student activist and member of Just Stop Oil.
Your protest, by definition, massively imperfect. I mean, the clothes that you're wearing, to some extent, owe their existence to oil because they were taken in a car or a truck or a van to a shop. You know, there are so many ways that oil impacts on your life as a protester, but you don't acknowledge that.
We're talking about crop failure by 2030. We're talking about people in this country right now in fuel poverty because of the prices of oil, and you're talking about the clothes that I'm wearing.
No, listen,
but this is so serious.
To be fair, up to now, you've answered questions, but that's a complete avoidance of the question. What about the accusation of hypocrisy, that actually you owe your lifestyle just as much to oil as the rest of us?
If we want to talk about hypocrisy, look at the government that has pledged for net zero by 20... But they pledged for net zero by 2050, and now they're looking at opening 42 new oil fields, which will be releasing fossil fuels into the 2050s. That is a death sentence for my generation and for your children.
Are you going to answer that question, or would you rather
how can we be talking about individual scale when we're asking the government to change so we as individuals no longer have to be reliant?
There are levels...
Cheers for Miranda. I would not have been able to keep my cool like she did in that conversation. Now, this isn't just a clip of a 65-year-old man attempting to bully and ridicule a 20-year-old activist on national TV. It is a disturbing example of the fossil fuel industry and its media allies using the so-called hypocrisy of activists to distract us from holding big interests accountable. This culture of shaming and blaming has affected my generations in ways you might not expect. Today, 70% of young people are eco-anxious, and 56% of young people believe that humanity is doomed. Eco-anxiety doesn't merely stem from the enormity of the climate crisis, but from misplaced responsibility. Greta Thunberg was embroiled in scandal when photographed with plastic packaging on a train. A friend of mine made national headlines in the UK and received rape and death threats when she walked through a field of bluebells, damaging some burgeoning bulbs. I was branded a hypocrite by the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar aviation company for flying to COP21 as a 16-year-old. Many of us have learned to deal with so-called trolls on the internet, and it's easy to dismiss them as old white men in need of therapy. However, I will say that it's a different ballgame when the rhetoric comes from within your movement, when it comes from folks who are meant to be on your side. There was the activist who called me a sellout for talking to people in companies, or the activist who told me I needed to be held accountable for attending an event hosted by a politician they disagreed with. A peer questioned if I could really call myself an activist, considering I'd never personally organized a protest. I often fear that if I voice an opinion that deviates from the collective, I'll be framed as some kind of infiltrator or sympathizer to the other side. On social media, if I remain silent on issues I honestly don't know much about, like the Israel-Palestine conflict or water pollution in Hawaii, then I'm complicit. But God forbid I only read an article and post it on my Instagram story, because then I'm performative. We recently surveyed some of our global youth community at Force of Nature. 83% said they had chosen not to post about a cause they cared about for fear of being called out. The fixation on individual actions has created this myth of perfectionism and served as a vehicle to undermine the credibility of people who are simply trying to make a difference. Our movement is descending into a circular firing squad of mutual mistrust and blame, weakening our collective ability to work together. This is also preventing folks from the outside from wanting to engage. A study from First Light surveyed the British public, and they found that 42% of people believe that they're being lectured to about climate change, and 53% of people feel powerless in the face of it. To quote one of the participants, Ellen, "I feel that we're being dictated to. We're told we must do this, we mustn't do that, and if you don't do it, then you're a really, really bad person, and you don't care about anything." Many participants from this study echoed this sentiment, being made to feel guilty for not participating in lifestyle changes, which are frankly often inaccessible, exclusive to those with the privilege of excess time and money. People also intuitively know that these individual actions do not amount to the change that is needed. Another participant, Brian, said, "No matter what we do in this country, if everybody toed the line on all the recommendations and everything else, we would possibly make a 1% difference." When I first started talking on social media about the need to progress beyond individual actions, I received a lot of really angry messages. A number of them, perhaps unsurprisingly, came from people who had started their own carbon tracking apps. But ironically, I have been that person. When I was 16, I designed an app to help people track the environmental impact of eating meat. I was convinced that if enough people understood the difference they could make in their personal lives, we could turn the world vegetarian. Now, the app landed me a job at Impossible Foods, the headline-grabbing company in Silicon Valley making meat from plants. Yet, I quickly learnt how inconsequential my approach was without systemic solutions. What Pat O'Brown, the founder, understood is that it wasn't effective to merely appeal to people's altruism or to expect them to give up something they loved for, let's be honest, soggy soy patties. Yes, people are willing to change, and yes, we need masses of individuals shifting their behavior. But that task was all but impossible without an alternative to meat that looked and tasted and even bled just like the real thing. A solution that was both accessible and irresistible. To take another example, yes, people should recycle. But if we're not lobbying politicians to regulate the companies flooding us with plastic, then we're ignoring the impending tsunami to fix a leaky tap. So I'm not discounting individual actions. I think they can be a great starting point and help people live in a way that feels aligned with our values. I just think we're capable of a whole lot more. You might start by composting in your own home. But what if you and your neighbors worked with your local council to ensure composting is the default in your community? Yes, you can share a petition on Instagram, but why not become part of an organizing group like Extinction Rebellion and participate in a direct action? Or join a group taking the government to court? In the next panel, you're going to hear from a friend who did exactly that. You can share a climate news story in your work chat, But what if you were to start a climate action meetup? Or if your current job doesn't focus on climate, what would happen if you moved to work for a cause that you truly care about? The average person will spend 90,000 hours at work over their lifetime. How do you want to make the most of that time? What I'm describing aren't one-off actions or incremental changes. I'm talking about activism in its truest meaning of the word. People working together for social, political, and environmental change. I'll end on a quote from one of my favorite films, The Hunger Games. Before Katniss enters the arena for the second time, her mentor, Haymitch, reminds her, remember who the true enemy is. Let us remember that the enemy is a system that reinforces inequality and injustice, a system that makes us complicit in mass suffering, a system that renders it near impossible to consistently do the right or responsible thing. So like the change makers who have come before us, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the Stonewall Uprising, people power is the only thing that ever changes the world. We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones. Let us retire the myth of individualism and work collectively with hands joined and with courage in our hearts to create a world by our own design. Thank you. Thank you.
That was fantastic. My children are 11 and under, and their role model just walked off the stage. That was fantastic. I want to welcome two catalysts for social change to the stage now. We're going to have a conversation with these two remarkable people. So, Luisa and Christian, if you would like to join me. Some water here. How's everything going today?
Awesome. How are you?
Oh, doing okay. Just want to be the proper host up here. There you go. So let me just take a quick second to introduce you both. So Luisa Neubauer is a leading figure in the German climate movement. Together with other activists, Luisa started FridaysForFuture in Germany and won a landmark case that we're going to hear more about, Neubauer versus Germany, which established the precedent that climate inaction is unconstitutional. Luisa hosts a Spotify climate podcast, 1.5 Degrees, and our friend Christian, welcome. Christian co-founded two activist incubators, makesense and Regroop. makesense disrupted the old citizen engagement paradigm, and Regroop is the first climate activism app that pushes leaders and politicians to tackle the most pressing issues of our time. So first off, enormous gratitude for the work you both do, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Please. Luisa, I would like to start with you. I want to understand how change happens, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind walking us all through the Neubauer versus Germany case to illustrate for us how change happens.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for being here. Technically it's a very short story, and it starts in 2018 in Germany. We started the Fridays for Future movement, and it was epic, to be honest, because there was a long-grown climate consciousness in the public, but there wasn't this one movement that people could unite behind. So we said, rock and roll, let's go. and it exploded. Like we were everywhere. Some of the people that kind of led this in the beginning are here in the room, and the doors were open. We were thousands, and we were 10,000, and we were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in all generations. 20,000 scientists came together as Scientists for Future, saying the children are right. We support what they do. And very early on, there was confusion in the political landscape. They didn't know what to do. What do we do with children or youth? And suddenly they speak up, you know. They'd been bullying us for being like politically ignorant for years. Now we were there politically. Now they were bullying us again for being politically active. You know how it is. And it grew and it grew and it grew. And by that time, I think it's important to understand Germany is one of the countries most responsible for the climate crisis. So it's the number 4th of the most emitting countries worldwide, historically spoken, and it's the German lignite coal mines that are the greatest source of CO2 of Europe. So it's a huge moral, historical, but also current responsibility. And we fought very, very hard for the German government to quit coal in the upcoming years. And the public awareness grew, and 10 months after we started, we organized for our biggest march yet to come. We organized this in more than 500 cities and towns across the country. We organized this with a global community worldwide. And in Germany alone, on that one day in September, 1.5 million people stood up for climate justice. We were everywhere. It was impossible to oversee. And the government, you know, rightfully scared of losing voters. By that time, you know, all the local state elections, they were all on the climate. It was the number 1 voter issue, so the parties, they were losing bad time. And the government, they looked around there, they freaked out, and they said, okay, look, we're going to do a climate law. We're going to do it. We're going to fix it the very same day of one big historic protest. So the government sat together under Angela Merkel, and they sat down for the first ever climate law to be introduced in Germany in 2019. And we were on the streets, and then the government called, and they said, yeah, we have a law now. We have decided on something. And we looked at the law that they presented to us, and one of the leading scientists in Germany commented the law with the words, I can't eat as much as I want to throw up over this. And it was 1.5 million people on the streets being shocked. And I mean, think of the number behind, you know, those who kind of think and feel for it, not yet going to the street. It was overwhelming. And the government has brought us to a point that people, they were in despair. They were thinking, you know, we want 1.5 million people on the streets. What else can we do? Where else should we go? What else do we do? You know, we are everywhere. We are in all companies, in all generations, in all sectors, and, you know, in all parts of the countries. What else can we do? And that is a time that I called this lawyer I heard about, because I've learned that in some other countries, they had sued governments. And I called this lawyer, and I said, hello, I'm Luisa from the Fridays. Can we do something about this? And she was like, no. And 4 months later, she came back, and she said, we can do something. And we're going to do it with 10, 20 other youth people, different NGOs, and we're going to do it as a collective case in front of the Constitutional Court. The German Constitutional Court is the most important, you know, court we have. It's highly respected, but only 2% of the cases in front of the Constitutional Court win. So we filed the case, and we thought, oh, you know, that's going to be a tight one. But, you know, we thought it was a nice act. You know, it's all performative, you know, symbolic. You know, we sued the government, yeah. The pandemic came, and 1 year later, my lawyer called me and said, Luisa, we might get a result on the case. And we were like, oh no. And I immediately went to the press and gave an interview on how after we lose, we have to stand up again. We prepared all for losing this. And we were like, yeah, you know, it was a nice time. You know, we tried to, yeah. And and the lawyer called again. It was a third very lucky phone call. And she called, and she's one of the most important environmental lawyers we have in the country. She's outstanding doing these cases. And she called me. She was still in bed. And she said, Luisa, OMG. It was like, I think that's good news. And then we won. And it's yes, but I think the most important part about the story is a different one. It's not that we won a court case which not only counts for Germany, it counts for every country in the world, because constitutionally spoken, climate inaction threatens the freedom of future generations. So we kind of reclaim the understanding of what is freedom in the climate crisis. It's climate inaction. Yet the most important aspect about this court case, and then you have your answer to the question. The most important thing is no, we will not get a shortcut in the climate crisis through courts. That is the number one question everyone asks. Will we solve the climate crisis at the courts in the world? No, we will not. We will change the systems and we will fight for justice and we will get this justice. But the most important part of that is not being done at the courts. It's being done on the streets, it's being done in the institutions, it's being done in the schools, it's being done in the conversations that we have. Then, once those normative and cultural and emotional and political changes are being fought for, then the courts can jump in. And they can take this, the normative changes that we have created, and work with that, and get good litigation done. But the hard work still needs to happen, and we would have never gotten this court case 5 years ago without the movements on the streets, without the people fighting for that. So on that September day, when 1.5 million people were on the streets, that was the most important thing they could do, and they didn't immediately saw the result, but the result came back to all of us 2 years later. And that, I think, is the most important lesson. The change we're fighting for is not linear, and sometimes it's coming back to us on the most unexpected occasions. Yeah.
Well said. Thank you. Christian, will you tell us about the paradigm that you're shifting and the innovations that you're making in citizen activism with Make Sense and with Regroop?
Yeah, so hello everyone, my name is Christian, I come from Tahiti, French Polynesia. Do you know where it is? Yeah, okay, cool. It's still over the water. If you guys work well after this conference, maybe it's gonna, and thanks to the case of Luisa, might stay above. So basically I started something called Make Sense. We help social entrepreneurs across the world. We have an impact investment fund of 100 million euros. I was doing this for 12 years. We supported projects like all the projects you see in this conference, building the solutions, and yet things seem to get worse and worse, especially on the climate. And so one day I went to the COP and I met Luisa, and then she said, you know, we need to stop the fossil fuel industries, like that's what the scientist says, it needs to stop. And so I started shifting things I was doing and working more into activism. And so there's an app, if you have an iPhone only for the moment, and that we're doing right now, where you can basically, for 20 seconds per day, try to stop oil pipelines with us and with activists from all around the world. And so it's been 1 year I've been campaigning mostly on ECOP, the East African crude oil pipeline, that's done by a shitty company. That's a French company named Total. Every time you see Total, say boo. And it's been 1 year we've been campaigning, and we're winning. We're getting 25 banks to drop the pipeline. I started working on it because Luisa told me to work on it, so it's really weird for me to be here on stage with the professor that's way younger than me, anyway. And so basically, we can win, we can stop these things. There's 420 carbon bombs in the world, new oil and gas projects. The science says we need to stop them. If we don't stop them, it's 3 times the carbon budget we still have left. But thanks to the work of all of you guys activists in the room, thanks to new tools like the one we're trying to develop, and thanks to collaboration between NGOs, we can really be more powerful than the dirtiest industry on the planet with the guns industry and the tobacco industry, which is the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, great. So my next question is for both of you, and it's going to be my opinion, and I imagine you will agree with me, but global governance and the current world order, the approach to the climate crisis and the collapse of nature, the approach isn't working. The UNFCCC, the COPs, they've yet to produce solutions that are anywhere near the magnitude of the problem. Our political systems seem not to be built for the purpose of outmaneuvering humanity's grand challenges, particularly the climate crisis. And so my question is, what is the alternative in your minds?
So for me, the alternative is we don't have time to wait for someone to solve this problem. I think we have 3 years to start declining the carbon emission. It doesn't mean like everything needs to be solved in 3 years, but we have to act now and fast. And we can't wait and demand for permission. And so the big thing for me is to realize that if you look on this case study of the East African crude oil pipeline, it's really easy to make this project that seems big. It's 5 billion euros. It will emit the emission, 35 million tons of emission, which is around 10% of carbon emission of France. So France is telling everyone, all its citizens, guys, we need to reduce by 2% our carbon emission, and they let a French oil company build only one of their 25 projects, which is 10%. So it doesn't make sense. And so it's basically, how do we rise and we say, okay, we're going to fight these guys, and we can win with people power. We have our tools. And we have amazing people like Luisa, and we can stop them. And so just I stopped saying it, but for example, to get the Dutch bank out, we just needed one tweet in Germany. You said, what the fuck are you going to finance ECOP? And then next day they drop. And so it shows there's huge power in the room to stop this oil and gas project.
Yeah, and I think I think we're getting really to the core of what we're looking at. You know, the modern democracies, maybe the French, the German, the British, whatever, all those democracies have been evolving with and from fossil fuels. There wasn't a time where modern democracies existed without fossil fuel supply. So political ideas, promises, programs, for as long as they existed in those countries, have spun around fossil productivity, fossil jobs, fossil progress, fossil welfare, fossil wealth. So if we say, let's decarbonize the largest, you know, the democracies around the world, and I mean, hopefully every other place as well, but since we're here, right? Let's say we decarbonize those places. This is not a technical question purely. It's a deep cultural shift that we're looking at. It means, you know, reshaping the DNA of those democracies, their very inherent first promises that they made to the people. Progress for such a long time had always to do with more destruction, with more emissions, with more resources. Understanding that we can deconstruct what progress is after all, what wealth is, what a good life looks like, you know, that is not a question we can solve with a nice CO2 concept paper. That's much more than that. That's about norms, it's about cultures, it's about emotion, it's about power after all. And so the good news is that as long as modern democracies have existed, they have risen up to the challenges. Oftentimes, you know, in a very exploitive way, and oftentimes with a weight like a price tag of human rights and colonialism and all these things. Yet we know that, you know, there are the other examples too, where people have fought for social justice, where they have fought for unions' rights and women's rights and workers' rights and all these things. Democracies have adapted, and there is a track record of that. So I sometimes don't know, as activists or as citizens, you know, we go around and we have a weekend because people have fought for it. We have a women's rights because people have fought for it. We have an 8-hour work day because people have fought for it. We would take all those privileges along, we could kind of snack them away as we go, but then deny our own ability to change the systems today. To me, that's double standards. To me, it doesn't work out, and I think it's a beautiful message that we, you know, that we not only own it to the future to go out and act, but we kind of also owe it to the past for those people who've made our lives, you know, and the infrastructure that we live in, the way they work today, and I think that's a liberating thought.
Yeah, I've actually never heard it put that way, but it is. It's very liberating. It's profound. So now I'm going to go into a somewhat of a vulnerable place. It's personal, and I hope that there are others like me struggling with the same question. But I am in the global minority. I'm a privileged 50-year-old white man, and I often find the microphone in my hands. And I would like to ask you both, in your eyes, what does true allyship, what does true solidarity look like from people like me? People with the privilege. What are you expecting from me?
Good question. Well, I think it's first important to acknowledge that, yes, technically you're a global minority, but you behave like you're the only ones that we you know, should care about. and like the white powerful man, you know, and so. And I think it's also important, or like helpful to me at least, to acknowledge that a lot of the, so that it's you're kind of human, that has this huge responsibility for the crisis that we're in, and that is now standing in the way when young people come and want to change stuff. So it's you know, there's a bit of a. I'm
aware.
There's a bit of a there's a footnote to that. And I think we just saw a good example here on the screen from Clover, what this means, you know. And I think it's a fascinating, but also, of course, hugely irritating situation to be in. To tell someone, "Hey, you caused a crisis," and then be, you know, shouted at. And I think the first important thing, of course, is, you know, passing on the mic. But I think the second thing is, and you did this, so good job, or you're doing it. And of course, I think you are not an atypical old white man, if I may say so, because obviously you do good stuff. But for everyone else, you know, it's a.
I think it's a compliment.
Okay, but it's but I think there's another. I think there's another note to that, and this is about acknowledging that. You know, we are very slow. We are too slow in how we get things done right now. We are trying to stop the big fossil fuel projects, but right now we are too slow. We're trying to transform the agricultural sector. We are too slow. We're trying to change the money flows away from fossil fuels into renewables. We are too slow. We're trying to get the human rights side along. We're too slow. We're trying to get the social justice side along. We're too slow, and all these things. And one of the most, you know, slowing factors is that the way that we have always, you know, we have to kind of deal with the emotions of the people who are currently in power, who are fearing to lose that power, rightfully. And so we, you know, and I think that doesn't concern you so much, but everyone else. I think it's important to acknowledge that we are dealing with a lot of hurt emotions of mostly men, mostly white men from the global north, who understand that their time is running off. And this will happen, but for us, I think it's important to understand that's what we're dealing with, and it shouldn't stop us for a single moment.
Thank you.
I'll be really quick. I'm kind of old now, and I decided one thing 2 years ago. I decided I would not listen to any ideas on climate of someone more than 30 years old, except if it's an IPCC scientist. And so now, because the main thing is that if the people in power are older, who always have, and I also always have an idea on how things should be done, if we knew, and I include myself, like if my generation knew, I'm 35 now, if I knew, or I used my 20s we wouldn't be in that mess. And so so they don't know. The only people, I think, who knows are the ones who are not yet brainwashed in what's possible or not by the 12 years or 20 years of career of learning how things work in a carbonized world. And so that's why I love to work with people less than 30, and so I just ask, what should we do? And I just shut my mouth and, okay, stop oil pipelines, let's go. And then like use the resources, the networks, whatever, to do what I've been told by someone less than 30. And I'm just gonna continue like that until my kid become, I don't know, old enough that he can tell me things to do, because maybe he might know better. Because at the end, yeah, I said the next generations of things like that. I was saying that before I had a kid. Now I really feel it when I say the world. It's really going to be the world of my kid, and I see him every day, and I don't want it to be fucked up. And so, yeah, I decided that the biggest agent of change are the young activists, especially what Fridays for Future have done, and we should just go all behind them and just go fast, so we win the time we're missing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is, by the way, I think that's it's a good trick to find out if, you know, we have a big room here of solutions, and I think sometimes it's a good thing to look at the proposed solution and very quickly ask if it's a real solution or it's another way to extend a business model that's actually run out of time. And I think sometimes, you know, we're in an era of greenwashing. It's quite helpful to check quickly. Is this because you are You know, you want to extend something that shouldn't be extended, or is it actually helping out of the crisis?
And just to rebound on that, there's an amazing paper done by researchers at Oxford, which they say like climate delaying is the new climate denying. And the big oil companies have been the best at putting narratives that help them win time. For example, Total, my best friends, they lied since the 70s, and they try to say first, climate change doesn't exist. Second, it's not as bad as it was meant. And now they say, we are the solution. The CEO of Total say, I need the black gold, my oil, to finance the green gold. And so he's pretending like he's going to save us while he put us in that mess in the first place. And this is also the things to be really careful and to look, because they're spending billions to brainwash us with those narratives.
Yeah. So with the few minutes we have left, I want to give you both the opportunity to give us your call to action. I want you to do that. The questions I wanted to ask you were for your call to action. I also wanted to ask you, what is the fire in your heart right now? And what are you going to be doing when you step off this stage and go out? Either one is fine.
Start quick to finish. So one word, download Regroop, R-E-G-R-O-O-P. Do you have your phones? Yeah? Can you put them in the air? Can you really put it and do the actions every day, help stop the pipeline? And also just listen to Luisa and her friends. Thank you.
We were laughing outside earlier. It's one of the few climate apps where I would say, oh, that's working out. That's good. I think, we heard about the CO2 footprint and how it's a very bullshit idea of, oil executives. There's something else to a CO2 footprint, that's a CO2 handprint, and that's actually the meaningful bit. The CO2 handprint means we are not just, consumers. We don't just matter when we decide between tofu and schnitzel, as a German. We are, ask yourself, what do you do 8 hours a day? Where do you work? If you have a bit of a privilege, and I would assume this is a room of privileges, to be fair. Ask yourself, what do you do every single day? Where do you put your energy in and your creativities and your thoughts and your visions and your attention? We will not get out of the mess voluntarily if others, as their full-time job, wreck everything that we all depend on. It's not working out. So consider where you work. Consider, what you do all day, every day, just because we need everyone on board right now. And Clover's right. It's not about the one perfect decision to make, but it's about getting going and understanding that it's not, this is not an afternoon the tea and coffee activity that we're doing when we say we need to stop the big fossil fuels from wrecking everything that we need. We will need people full time on this. And I think that's the number one thing. And secondly, we learned about the climate anxiety and about how this is, taking lots of energy. And there's something beautiful. It's called a crisis muscle. And we all have it. And this crisis muscle needs to be nurtured. And it's nurtured best when we come together and stand up to the crisis that we're in. Because a crisis is there every day. And we can tell ourselves every day that it's too much and that we can't do anything and that we're just one person and, it's way too big and, what else can I do and I'm not the one and someone else will come along. We can tell that to ourselves every single day. But this will take energy from us. So we might as well take that very energy and go ahead and do this one thing and go to the one event and join this one community and join this one movement and have this one conversation that gets us going. And then we realize, the crisis will be there, and every single year of our lives will be possibly more crisis. But we can grow up to understand how to navigate through these crises and to make, to make something that is way more beautiful and way more just than just a dire future full of crises. But it can actually be just and better and good for people everywhere. Yeah, thank you.
The last words were yours, so just a bit of a hug.
Sorry.
Appreciate you. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. That was exactly what I thought it would be. action. We use the word inspiration. I believe it's a bit flimsy. Let's act. Let's follow their leads. So now we have the great opportunity to get to know Jeremy Heimans. And I'm going to invite Jeremy up, and then I'm going to introduce him. But welcome, my friend. We finally meet. How are you? Good to see you. So, I think I messed up. This is my first facilitation, moderation, but maybe they'll invite me back, maybe not. Okay. This might be one of the busiest people that I know. So Jeremy has been building movements since he was 8 years old. He is the co-founder and CEO of Purpose, a public benefit corporation with offices on 6 continents. Purpose builds and supports movements for an open, just, and habitable world. He's co-founder of Get Up. This is an Australian political organization with more members than all of Australia's political parties combined. He's also co-founder of Avaz, the world's largest online citizens movement, now with more than 65 million members. And last but not least, he is the co-author of a book that is titled New Power: How Power Works in Our Hyper-Connected World and How to Make It Work for You. So welcome, my friend, and you're not busy at all these days, are you?
Well, it's great to be here and great to be in Paris with all of you, and looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's such a privilege for me to be associated with all of these remarkable people, and I've obviously read so much about you, so I've been looking forward to this for a long time. But I would like for you to tell us about your activism and how you came to understand New Power.
Yeah, well, as Jonathan said, I got started very young. So, and unlike Luisa and Clover, who I would say were more sophisticated activists as young people than I was, back in my day, you know, when I started this kind of work, I was organizing fax campaigns. So trying to get people to send faxes en masse, which is an extremely limiting activist tool. And it led to many failures, really. When I tried to get people to mass fax the hotel where, at age 12, I think it was, where the Iraqi foreign minister and the US Secretary of State were meeting on the eve of the Gulf War, we got maybe, I don't know, 40, 50 faxes through that one machine, right? So the techniques have changed, but for me, that's been a through line in my life. And fast forward a little bit to 2004, and suddenly we had the internet, and I was a student at that time, and we all thought that the worst possible president that could ever be was George W. Bush, and it turned out that there's been one worse since then. And so it was 2004, we were trying to get George Bush out of office. And so that was when we started experimenting. And that time is a really exciting time when we were figuring out how to use the internet in new ways to mobilize people. And so we did things like organize one of the very first ever political crowdfunding campaigns to fly a group of women whose loved ones had died in Iraq around to chase Dick Cheney wherever he was. It was called the Chasing Cheney campaign. And so, you know, that's kind of my story, and that then led to a whole bunch of other things in the years that have followed.
Fantastic. I would like to ask you to open up to us a little bit, and you know, your influence and your successes are very well known, and huge gratitude for everything you've done since, you know, you were 8 years old. What failures have you encountered personally or professionally, and what have they taught you about activism?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that some of my biggest failures in my work as an activist were actually some of the moments that appeared to be the most successful, right? So there are these campaigns you can run that you get millions of people to sign the petition or to get involved, that speak to people's, you know, hearts, or that get people angry. But a number of those campaigns, and this is also how my work as an activist has evolved a lot over the years, were really just exercises in virtue signaling to ourselves, right? Now, it's absolutely important that people who share the same values get riled up, get motivated, take action. That's a critical theory of change. But I do think that as activists, we need to be honest with ourselves about some of the incentives, right, that we have as activists. And so to make this concrete, thinking about refugees as an issue. So I've been working over many years on different kinds of campaigns around refugees. And, you know, I think the correct thing to do, right, if you're a progressive activist, is to try to humanize refugees. So center the voices of refugees, have refugees speak about their own experiences in an attempt to persuade people that they should support the rights of refugees. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's very important, and it has its own merits. But what I learned on refugees, for example, was that doing that over and over again didn't change the minds of the people that we actually need to shift policies on refugees. So the way we sort of made progress on that issue was when we realized that the people in this room don't need convincing anyway, right? And those were the people who wanted to hear from the refugees. But when you actually spoke to the people who were conservative or skeptical about refugees, but who had welcomed refugees into their own communities. So there are these programs all over the world. They're called refugee sponsorship programs, right? Where people agree to sponsor a refugee. Often it's quite religious, quite conservative people, and then they bring a refugee or a family into their community. When you record those people talking about how their prejudices shifted, how their lives changed as a result of getting to know and building deep relationships with refugees, that message is much more effective, right, at actually persuading skeptical people to support policies that help refugees. And that's not necessarily the message that's most comfortable or most easy. And so I think in my career, particularly in my early career, we ran a lot of campaigns that got millions of people involved. Some of them were really effective, and others, I think, less so. Partly because your incentive as an activist, and this is where the dangers are, can sometimes be either rack up the numbers or do something that feels very comfortable within the epistemic frame, the community that we're comfortable within. And I think that's a big structural mistake, you know, if we actually want to unlock the change that we need to on so many of these issues.
Yeah, thank you. I realize before my next question, I need to ask you to describe old power and new power. If you could do that for us, and then I want to talk about new power.
Yeah, so this concept of new power is something that, that Henry Timms and I sort of developed partly just in response to what the debates we were seeing in the world, particularly in that early social media era. So if you remember the Arab Spring, right, and everyone would have this constant debate about the Arab Spring. Did Twitter cause the Arab Spring, right? And then when the Arab Spring kind of went wrong, people were like, well, Twitter doesn't work. And to us, that was a really limiting way to understand social change. Because as an activist, the one thing you know is that if you really want to understand what's happening, you have to understand power. Who has it, who doesn't, how it works. So the concept of old and new power was a frame we developed that was to help give people a better language to use when talking about change. So in very simple terms, the difference between old and new power. You know, we all know what old power is, right? It's what most of the machinery of our societies works on, right? The analogy we use is it's power as currency, right? The more of it you have, the more powerful you are. You hoard it up, and then you have more power, right? New power, though, we were trying to describe the sort of power that Fridays for the Future, that folks like Clover are exercising, right, today. It's not the same kind of power. It isn't the same kind of power. You can't hoard it up. It's not something you spend to reward your friends and punish your enemies. It's a different power because it's about harnessing participatory energy. It's about channeling the power of many people's collective action. And it's enabled by technology, no doubt, but it's actually a very distinct mindset and a very distinct set of skills. And that's kind of what we described in our work in Harvard Business Review and then in our book on new power. And to be very clear, it can be used by the good guys and the bad guys. And a big theme of our work has increasingly become the way the bad guys have co-opted new power and what we do about it.
Can we stay there for a second? Can you just, what do we do about it?
Well, I mean, I think part of the issue is that we can't unilaterally disarm. So, and this is often, an issue. Like, people rightly are outraged by the way social media companies, for example, have monetized and monopolized and co-opted all of this participatory energy to, not only to make money for themselves, but also to polarize and to damage democracies. But those who are spreading hate and disinformation are using these tools, right? We wrote an article before COVID, weirdly the year before COVID, saying analyzing the phenomenon of vaccine skeptics and vaccine disinformers, basically, saying these guys threaten to really undermine global public health. We didn't know what was about to come. And the vaccine skeptics are brilliant at using new power. They don't have a lot of institutional power. They don't have the bully pulpit of government, typically, although they do in some states in the United States now. But they do have these very powerful communities that they can use to, from actually a very small number of people are the originators of the information, and then that information metastasizes and spreads through these communities. So the biggest implication, I think, is that those of us in this room who kind of share a set of values need to use new power, but we also need to change the structure in which we're all operating, right? And there's probably been not enough attention by activists on changing the technology architecture, on pushing back around the power of big tech, and we're seeing that again now with AI.
I want to come back to AI, which is something I know virtually nothing about, but I know you do. But I've been told that there aren't any stupid questions, so here goes. And you've touched on this already, but what happens to modern day movements and new power when the electricity literally goes out? And I'm only asking this half joking. I've spent the bulk of my life with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, in parts of the world responding to conflict, et cetera, where literally power doesn't exist. And so really the question that I want to ask you is, can new power be truly accessible and inclusive?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely true that this ain't evenly distributed, right? And that's a big problem. And it's part of why, again, activists, there are a certain set of issues that are relatively unsexy, but they're structural, right? One is the corrupting influence of money and politics and the way that impacts democracy, and a set of issues around democracy. Really hard to build movements around process, right? And another is the architecture, particularly this online environment that we're in and how it's built. That stuff is a bit arcane. How do we reform that? How do we increase access to technology? But it tends to be the kind of, it defines the playing field that we then all play on as activists. So what I would say is, on the plus side, I've seen some brilliant examples of activism that don't rely on technology, right? Or that use extremely low-tech tools. And people are incredibly ingenious about using whatever technology they have at the time. And I've described in the past the phenomenon of missed calls campaigns as a good example of this. So in places like India and sub-Saharan Africa, where people can't afford to use data on their cell phones, activism evolved to create these campaigns where people would call a number and hang up before it incurred any phone charges as a way of registering an action and then coordinating offline protests. So people will find a way, but that doesn't change the structural problem that you identify, Jonathan, which is that we as activists need to spend more time figuring out how to level that playing field.
Thank you. Yeah. For those of us that are waking up every morning, going to work, to deal with a sick planet, to try to reverse the climate crisis, to try to reverse nature's collapse, through your lens of new power or just your massive experience with activism, what is your advice? What is your guidance? What do you see that's working? What do you see that maybe we could be doing a little bit differently?
Well, first, I mean, incredibly inspiring hearing from the climate activists that we've heard from today. And what they're doing is super smart and strategic, right? What Luisa described, for example, in Germany. I think, let me tell you a story about some climate activism that Purpose has done that I think is instructive. And it speaks to this point I made about reaching the audiences that are usually neglected by activism. So a few years back, Poland was hosting the COP, right? And so our climate lab at Purpose had to figure out, is there something useful we can do, given that the Polish government, as you know, is right-wing, it's quite hostile to climate action, and it's also, frankly, there's a very strong relationship between the right-wing politics of Poland, the coal industry, and the Catholic Church. So we looked at that and we said, well, what's the best lever to break that? And we identified conservative Catholics, right, who were key to the base of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. So basically, we worked with activists in Poland and organizers in Poland to basically help to sprout a Catholic Polish climate movement. And one of the most interesting things we discovered when we started this work was that most Catholic Poles are not big fans of the current Pope, right? They think he's too left-wing, they probably think he's a bit woke, but they do love, unsurprisingly, the Polish Pope, John Paul II. So we went back to people who'd worked with and knew John Paul II, who could be voices from there. We went back to John Paul II's scriptures, right, because he actually spoke a bunch about nature and environmental stewardship, and developed a campaign that was so different to the kinds of language and climate campaigns that we normally see, right? And it was prayer cards in churches, and it was organizing so that Catholic priests would give sermons, right, in churches in Poland the week of the COP. And we had thousands and thousands of these sermons. And I think the mark of the success of the campaign was that, while the Polish government is still no great friend of climate action, we were able to get to the point where the Polish environment minister stood up in the COP and said, and again, this may make some people feel uncomfortable, right? And said, we cannot cede the issue of climate change to the left. Climate change is also a conservative issue, right? But I think that's the kind of thing we need, right? Because we're not going to win simply by rallying progressives alone. So that's an example of a strategy that was quite different. There are lots of things that I would so strongly disagree with the Catholic Church on, right? But the ability to work with them on that, and we worked with the Vatican, right, because the current Pope, of course, is a very strong proponent of climate action on that campaign, I think is an example of some stuff that I'm seeing that is working.
If you could come to my country and help us cross the tribal lines, that would be incredible. That's the U.S.
I live there too, so
okay.
I live it.
So back to AI. I know next to nothing about AI.
Yeah.
But the friends of mine who are much smarter than I am say it's something I should be scared to death about. And so I just want you to put it in the context of activism, civic action, movement building, new power.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this, and there's no doubt that it's a really big deal. I don't think we fully know how it's going to play out. But here's a way to think about it. Like, our work on New Power described this explosion of participation by ordinary people. The fact that now everybody in this room could start a movement, could start a campaign. The Greta example is such an inspiring one, right? That one girl who helped to spark not one girl's campaign, but actually this huge ecosystem of self-organized campaigns. But the new world we're about to enter is in which there is a new participatory agent that is arriving, and that is the machine. So alongside humans, suddenly we have these machines, and I use machines as essentially a shorthand for these AI models that are configured to interact directly with humans, to be human-like, and in some cases to be directly mistaken for humans. So there'll be lots of situations where we don't know whether we're really speaking to a human or a machine. And these participatory agents are going to have a huge impact on the way both old power and new power play out. So I think one very concerning feature of this is that we could see a massive reconcentration of information. So these chatbots that we're going to talk to are going to become our best friends. You know, you could almost think of them as your digital significant other. We're going to interact with them. They're going to give us these very personalized, very useful answers. And I think increasingly we're going to rely on these digital significant others for answers, for information that we used to get from social media and that we used to get from search. And so all of that information gets laddered up to this one voice who will synthesize these very persuasive answers just for you. And I think that's quite scary, because that means that there'll be enormous power in the hands of the owners of those machines in determining what those voices say, and perhaps even more concerning, the owners of those machines themselves don't fully understand how they work, and they find that in a sense, their workings are indecipherable because of the nature of the technology, these LLMs, right? And so therefore, not even the owners of the machines really control them. So from an activist perspective, we've been trying to think about what it all means. And I do think we're going to see that these new tools give both good actors and bad actors a really major set of new tools. So you'll see this kind of information bombing dynamic, where you used to be able to, you know, if you were ISIS, for example, you could spread propaganda person to person online, and that was very effective at recruiting. But imagine if you could create 10,000 times the amount of content that the ISIS folks created, but that content would also be more personalized. So they would know, okay, we're not just trying to recruit young girls from the West over to Syria. We're trying to find the exact preferences and interests of those teenagers, and we're going to produce 1,000 different versions of a piece of content in the voice of what appears to be a human designed to recruit those people. That's a very, very scary prospect, but it again also means that activists who are fighting things like for climate action will need to figure out how to use these tools as well, but in a way that is ethical and in a way that doesn't create some of these runaway train dynamics. So I think it's going to be really important for, again, all of us to be highly engaged with these debates, and as activists, think about how these tools get used very quickly.
We're a minute over, but I want to give you 20 seconds to tell us, what are you doing now? When you leave here, what is in your heart? What's going on? In 20 seconds.
Well, I mean, right now, I'm queer, and I am working, one of the issues I'm working on is I feel like queer people and trans people, yet again, are being turned into the boogeymen all over the world. In America, where I live, by populists, by authoritarians. So one of the things I'm working on right now is there something we can do to stem the tide of this backlash against queer people? Because I think that it's a canary in the coal mine for many, many other minority groups, because essentially the fight is this idea that queer people represent modernity, decadence, the modern world. And they won't just come for queer people, but as you've seen in the US, they're coming for women and their reproductive rights. They're coming for people of color. And so, given that's one of my identities, I'm working on some new ways to organize queer people around the world transnationally to address that problem.
Dude.
Thanks.
You're a star. I appreciate you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We are a little bit behind, but you get the last word. I want this side to stand up and shout change, and this side to stand up and shout now. This is to bring some energy in the room. This is for thanks to the Change Now organizers, thanks to Jeremy, Luisa, Christian, Clover. Change. All right. Thank you very much.